everybody, and welcome back to another episode of That CMMC Show. Today, we have an interesting intersection of topics. We have CMMC and CUI joined with that of the export control world. And who better to talk to it than the president of DTS, Stephen Casazza, there's your word, I got your last name right, that go, to actually walk us through the intersection of CUI and export control, when they play together, when they could potentially play apart. And then because this is around the Halloween time, we're going to share some horror stories of export control, which everybody loves to talk about. So, Stephen, Mike, over to you, my friend. Who is DTS and what services you guys actually provide in this space? What do you guys do?
Thank you very much, Daniel, for the introduction. And thanks to Summit 7 for having me on the podcast today. So Steve Casazza, President of Defense Trade Solutions. And what we do is, my team's pretty lucky. They get to wake up every morning and, like your team, help make the world a safer place. And what they do is they're really a fractional global trade compliance office for small and mid-size aerospace and defense companies, really helping navigate ITAR, EAR, foreign military sales, technology security and foreign disclosure, logistics, customs compliance, and international government affairs type issues. So for those small, mid-sized companies that don't have access to 100 export control nerds or 100 foreign military sales experts, we're the shop to go and make that happen for those companies and really help make export controls a competitive advantage for them and not a hindrance to international business.
Trade compliance as a service.
Exactly.
What a great thing. Because I know a lot of MSPs and MSSSPs out there, but not a lot of people that want to play in the export control regulation trade compliance game. So it's nice to know SMB doesn't have to be left out of having to hire multiple six-figure salaries to just do one part of their business. They can call you guys up and be like, hey, I just need some help figuring this thing out. How do I even get a license for this thing, right? What are the steps I have to do? Is this even export control? I've been getting that question so much recently. Is like, the things I have actually export control or not? I was like, I don't know. I'm not a trade compliance guy. It's like, I can help you by putting you at the USML, right? It's like, if it looks like it's in there, well, you're probably got a problem. And then I was like, call Steven. He can help you.
Spot on. And one of the interesting things too is that everything we just described generally in the export control world, it requires multiple different kinds of humans. So generally expertise falls into a licensing, compliance, logistics, releasability, FMS kind of category. And so, rather than having to have 5 different kinds of humans, you really get, for the price of one, you get all those different areas of expertise.
Man, that's awesome. Which brings us to really one of the first major points. And again, you and I have kind of wrestled with this topic off and on. I actually was able to write a piece around export control violations that we're actually seeing simply because people are now doing CMMC. Because what I've realized very quickly, even small businesses that have some sort of trade compliance support, they're typically not talking to IT, and IT is definitely not talking to them. And so you have people stamping things and getting things processed and licenses and, classifications. You've got that whole team doing that piece, but they're not like, hey, IT, I think we're in the wrong Microsoft cloud, because they have no one, like, they don't necessarily care per se. They're doing their part of the job. And so one of the first things I always like to bring up is that CUI and export controller, CUI and ITAR, those are two different things, two different requirements for protection. But ITAR can also fit under CMMC if it's done under a federal contract. And so can you kind of walk me through, when do I treat these independent? And then when do I have to treat them as like a single thing?
Absolutely. And so it's a very interesting Venn diagram we have of CUI versus export control information. So talking about it from an export control perspective first, really export control information falls into 2 flavors. You have ITAR controlled technical data, which is technical details, information, software, et cetera, pertaining to defense articles. And then you have EAR controlled technology, which is similar, but on the commercial and dual use side of things. And those are the regulatory definitions when it comes to export controlled information. There's no consideration really for whether that information was developed under a U.S. government contract, whether it was developed by the company, whether it's developed by an individual. It's really whether or not you meet those definitions in the regulatory requirements under the ITAR or the AUKUS. Full stop. So that's one side. And then the other part of the Venn diagram is your controlled unclassified information, which for our purposes here with the aerospace and defense industry is really that information that is being provided to companies under US government contracts or when bidding on US government contracts in some kind of capacity. Now, the US government, when categorizing controlled unclassified information, one of the categories can be export controlled information. And so that's when the US government goes and they have their own technical data or technology. And so it's technical data and technology that meets the definitions of both the ITAR and the EAR, but it's also being provided through the course of contractual discussions or contractual requirements. And because the US government is providing it to a contractor, they mark it underneath the umbrella of controlled unclassified information as well.
So if I'm hearing this right, so I know that Department of State runs the ITAR program, we'll say.
Mhm.
Department of Commerce runs EAR, which obviously in the world of DoD, those are separate agencies completely. Now, DoD is saying, hey, with DFAR 7012 and CMMC, anything that's CUI, apply the 110 controls of NIST 171, FedRAMP moderate clouds or equivalent clouds, incident response, flow downs to your subs, accountability of your subs, and things like that. But if I'm making a weapon for the DoD, not only is that CUI because it's on a federal contract and the type of data is considered controlled unclassified information, but now I've got the Department of State looking at me in the sense of, oh, that's an export requirement as well. And you're saying that my export controlled data can either be developed proprietary through my organization or on behalf of a federal contract. And no matter what, I still have to also abide by that, which, correct me if I'm wrong, most of those on under the commerce and state side are data sovereignty. So keep the data in the US unless you have an appropriate license, and an access requirement, which is US persons or those with technical assistance agreements can be the ones that see this or access this information. Is that the extent of the extra requirements kind of above and beyond what CUI is? Or is there even more nuance to what you can actually do with that data from an export control piece?
At a high level, that is the main requirement. It's really where, where the data is stored and resides, right? And so that's, from an export perspective, it's in the if it's in the US, it's not an export, right? But if it moves outside of the US, then it would be an export. But then there's also a release component, which is
Okay.
you can have something that is, controlled from an export perspective, but it's data that is only being accessed by US persons and you can prove that and there are the right encryption controls around that, in which case there are exemptions to allow for export control, either technical data or technology outside the US for exclusive US persons use because people travel and all of that. But if there is a release of that information or that technical data or that technology, then those certain exemptions don't apply anymore because you've now just transferred that information, technology, or technical data to a non US person. And so what ends up being very challenging for exporters when they are not looking at export controls from a IT perspective
Yeah.
is they'll have export control data all over the place, all
Yeah.
over either their cloud infrastructure or even their servers, and they don't really know where it is and where it resides. And it becomes very hard to prove the negative of that your information has not been exported outside the United States, or there has not been a release of that technical data or technology to IT personnel that are managing the backup halfway around the world, right? And so one of the great things about CMMC and the intersection, I think, of CUI and export controlled information is that CMMC is really providing that cybersecurity hygiene that allows for not just the protection of CUI in a sufficient way, but also the protection of export controlled information in a sufficient way, even if it wasn't developed under a U.S. government contract. If you're maintaining good cybersecurity hygiene to comply with CMMC, a byproduct of that is you're going to, as long as you know where your export controlled information is, you can apply those same principles to your export control data.
So that's, I think, was interesting is like access controls are really big family in CMMC. And this, it's like, listen, first family, you got to control the devices and people and service accounts that are actually accessing, right? Hard stop, like that's just level one kind of stuff. So when I wrote that blog not too long ago, it was inspired by a conversation I had with a very large weapons manufacturer. And they do a combination of defense and commercial, but I'll call them a household name when it comes to weapons. And I remember being on the call with them and their IT team, and we were battling around cloud providers. Hey, we're in commercial today, and we think we're good. It's like, okay, well, let me pull up Microsoft's contractual obligation to you. And Microsoft says, no, no, no. You have ITAR, EAR, technical data packages related to that. You can't put it in commercial because, to your point, Microsoft will not prove that has not been released to somebody else or another country, right? If they have a disaster recovery effort or something like that. And so in this conversation, the IT team's like, well, we think we're okay. I was like, okay, why don't you call your trade compliance team? Because they're big enough. I was like, I would love to just have you on the call and have me on the call and have them on the call. And about 30 seconds into that follow-up meeting we had, all of a sudden, their trade compliance, when I'm talking about unauthorized disclosures or release of information, uh, and I show them the Microsoft terms and I show them that beautiful little ITAR crosswalk, and they look at me and they look at their IT team and say, no, we're actually in violation and we need to hang up the call right now and we need to go remediate things. And so it's just interesting when you hear this stuff, that conversation, I don't think would have ever happened unless CMMC was in the mix, primarily talking about data sovereignty of cloud providers, their external support team, because they had an MSP, a global MSP, problematic, and just the simple fact of like, hey, we're just in the wrong cloud. Like this cloud provider is not actually allowing us the contractual requirement that we need to say that this data is protected according to not only the DoD, but something that carries even more penalties, which is an export control violation with like the Department of State or Department of Commerce. And so what's interesting in that, and I'm going to skip kind of down to a question is, horror stories around that. So we'll get into industry updates here at the tail end of that, but I want to jump straight. It's around the Halloween season, and we jokingly say, and it's kind of tongue in cheek, whoever makes the decision to do something the improper way, whether that's because they don't have the money to do it or just want to lean into it because it's easier. And they're like, somebody's making that corporate risk decision about mishandling this information. We always like to joke and say, who has to write the check or who gets to wear orange, right? Who looks good in, silver bracelets, if you will. And so CUI, there hasn't been a lot of, uh, how do you say this? A lot of like lawsuits per se yet, right? There's False Claims Act, and that's starting to ramp up more with the Civil Fraud Initiative or the Cyber Fraud Initiative. But export control has a track record of decades of, hey, we're going to put you in jail or we're going to charge you a lot of money for violation of this. And so much of the defense industrial base, because they're dealing with this technical information as space or military application, they're simultaneously working with export control and CUI, and they most of the time have no idea.
Yes.
So if you were to tell the viewers that are watching this, what are some penalties or what are some horror stories of past organizations who have done this incorrectly? Just to kind of like liven it up and make it a little bit more real that if you do this the wrong way, there actually are repercussions to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I won't call out specific companies, but at a high level, I will say, just from the ITAR from that perspective, each individual violation of the ITAR carries up to it a civil penalty of a little over $1.2 million per individual violation. And so what we tell our customers is just the way the ITAR is structured, it's actually really hard to only violate the ITAR once.
Oh, interesting.
Usually, if you mess up, it's you violated the ITAR no less than a dozen or 2 dozen times in different spots. And so what ends up happening is companies that get caught for violations with the ITAR, State Department, Department of Justice, when they decide to go after them, and improve the compliance program, they'll say, we'll have reason to believe you violated the ITAR all of these different hundreds of times. But if you consent to guilt under this consent agreement and agree to these remedial compliance measures, we'll only fine you, $50 million. And half of that you can reinvest into your compliance program. So my hat's off to Department of State for really having a structure where they're not just going after companies, they're, for dollars for the sake of dollars. They're actually having the companies reinvest that money into building best in class compliance programs. And so onto the horror stories. I mean, so in terms of, I actually think this is companies that struggle the most with this in the defense industrial base are those companies that actually deal with both uh, dual use commercial and military, because what tends to happen is they tend to be global companies. They tend to have mixed workforces from a US national and foreign national perspective. And when you're a company, you want to have as much innovation happening as possible, which means as much access and collaboration as possible, right? And so we know a number of companies, that have been under consent agreement where they have a military division and a commercial division, and the commercial division employs Chinese nationals and foreign nationals in China, Hong Kong, etc. And without the proper IT access controls, those nationalities, allegedly had access to a number of documents, data, information related to military programs. And China is one of the countries that we're actively competing with from a defense industrial base. So that data could very well give the Chinese defense industrial base an edge in reverse engineering what we're doing here in the United States. So that's one horror story. I would say another, and this is kind of going the other way, and this recently happened. So it's actually what happens when there's a little bit of over control.
Oh, interesting.
We have a situation right now with the customer that's in this case, where there are a number of documents that were received by a government contractor that were marked CUI from the U.S. government, and the reasons for control parameters were export controlled information, and specifically calling that export control information ITAR control information. And when you look at the documents that were received by that company, it's financial info, it's programmatic info, the things that are technical. In looking at it, if you actually do the jurisdiction and classification analysis, it's for parts and components of the overall program that is not ITAR controlled. It's, best case EAR controlled, potentially even not EAR controlled, EAR 99 potentially. And so there's a situation where the US government, just by the nature of, government employees potentially rounding up to be safe and all of that, over
CYA with not only CYA with ITAR, it sounds like.
Right. And now we're in an active situation where we're trying to work through, our customers, a sub in this case, work through the prime to then work through with the government to say, hey, we've done this analysis against the ITAR and the EAR, and there's no technical data or EAR controlled technology here. So because we want to go and do other things and not be subject to those controls, can you remove these markings? And we're actually having to educate the government on how export controlled information, you don't just slap a label on that. There's actually an analysis that you have to go through with the ITAR and the EAR to come to those conclusions.
Yeah.
And it's becoming a very difficult challenge for the company.
A lot of people are like, oh, it's just like FOUO days. Like, we see disclaimers on emails, like signature blocks. It's like, this email may contain CUI. And it's like, hey, do you want to go have lunch today? It's like, well, number one, that doesn't contain CUI. Nice try. But to your point, it's making the burden on the subs and the primes unnecessarily burdensome. And it's like, guys, like we want to protect the data. We want to do the right thing. But also don't say everything is CUI. Don't say everything is ITAR. Just don't do that, because now, honestly, it's a little problematic, because now we end up in these weird disputes where we're having to come back as the contractor, not the people who wrote the regulation, the people who are trying to follow it and educate you about the thing that you wrote, right? And anyways, that's a tale as old as time from the
Yeah.
industry parts that I've been a part of. It's very frustrating, and the subs and primes should just kind of be, how do I say this? They should be frustrated, because they're trying to do the right thing. And so, anyways, DoD, Department of State, Department of Commerce, please, or Department of War, I guess now, please try and not overmark things for the sake of your supply chain. They would greatly appreciate it. I'm going to snip this, put it on LinkedIn. We're going to tag a bunch of people saying, please just don't do this, guys. Be better. Okay, horror stories to side because those are really good, and it's interesting. It shows both sides of it. It's like we try to do the right thing, but then they're coming after us for kind of benign stuff, and then also like, hey, we actually did the wrong thing, and there's penalties associated with that. I keep hearing about this AUKUS thing. This AUKUS thing is making the rounds. I've got Australian friends. They care about it, I think, more than the US does. They're very interested in bringing that work to Australia. Tell me about just general industry updates, even outside of AUKUS. What's happening in the export control space that I should know that could impact my organization?
Yeah, absolutely. And AUKUS will be a part of this. But so at the high level, just even beyond export controls and just looking at the defense industrial landscape for a second, between when it comes to Doge that happened earlier this year and now the U.S. government shutdown, what we've seen in the past 6 months, numerous defense companies are U.S. defense companies are looking to diversify their portfolio away from domestic business and towards international. you know, just trouble at home being one of those data points. And then also the world becoming more and more an unsafe place. Our allies are training and equipping themselves, but they're still reliant on the US defense industrial base in order to be able to do that effectively and be interoperable, whether we're talking about Europe, whether we're talking about Taiwan, whether we're talking about Israel. So between those two things, just the marketplace is ripe for US defense companies going after international business. So we've seen a lot more activity in that area, and it's smart for companies to do that.
Yeah.
That's data point one. Data point two is it's becoming very, very challenging to be a global trade compliance professional.
Mm.
The kinds of questions that are coming out of this environment from, I would say, market pressure plus significant amount of reform, both on the export control side as well as the foreign military sales and direct commercial sales side, between border doing FMS and DCS reforms to amendments to the ITAR from a USML, what are reasons for control perspective, to the 50% rule on the EAR, the foreign direct product rule on the EAR. I was at a conference in the UK a few weeks ago where I heard a term that I never thought I'd hear. It's called EAR taint. So we knew about ITAR taint in terms of keeping the ITAR away from things sold in Europe to prevent extraterritorial controls on European products. But now they're worried about EAR taint because the EAR's reach is starting to become deeper and deeper into Europe. And so all of these reforms, while a lot of them are good, and will result in deregulation, the other half are more and more stringent controls. So that's creating a lot more regulatory complexity for global trade practitioners to wade through. So that's a second data point. A third is this administration has actually increased the amount of export control enforcement that has been occurring. So if you talk about headcount increases, both in state and commerce, the focus is really more on enforcement and compliance personnel. You're seeing the fines that I quoted have actually increased. The numbers that I quoted are higher than they were last year. And you're hearing a lot more enforcement actions, coming out of that too. So the environment's more complex. There's more demand for U.S. military technology, and there's a higher risk. So global trade compliance professionals, it's not like we've gotten smarter as the time has gone on, or there's not like there's more of us that have just appeared.
Right.
We're feeling the strain of that. So my heart goes out to all fellow global trade compliance professionals that are just trying to get by these days. But with all that said, I would say that it's important to have access for defense companies to have access to that kind of expertise, because it's going to be the only way you're able to compete, to navigate this landscape. And so that brings me to AUKUS. So AUKUS is something that I'm a huge proponent of. I think it is a great initiative, both at the high level in terms of going and really taking the three defense industrial bases and making them tighter and collaborate more, not just with nuclear power submarines, but also amongst our industries. Uh, and the AUKUS exemption and the expedited licensing timelines around that are great tools for global trade practitioners to have in their toolbox. And a number of our customers, we've been navigating the exemption and using it quite effectively for them. Having said that, we still, and this is kind of the chatter around AUKUS, is that it doesn't go far enough, and that there are a number of defense companies that are not using the AUKUS exemption or the AUKUS tools in their toolbox, largely because of the complexity around it. So there's a trade-off with everything, right?
Sure.
And so you basically add complexity for increased speed and agility. And so what tends to be happening, and this was talked about in the AUKUS forum last week, is that a lot of the business development professionals at defense companies, they're the ones that are benefiting from the speed and agility of AUKUS, right? They get to go talk to their industry colleagues faster. They don't have to wait for licenses. It's great for them.
Oh yeah, they love it.
They love it. The people that take the complexity side of the equation are all the global trade people that now, you know, have to make a number of decisions every day and are inherently risk diverse humans, which makes them good at their job.
Yeah.
And so if there's something more complex and inherently has a little bit more risk to it, and I only have so many hours in the day, we're hearing a lot of global trade professionals default to just doing licenses and doing business as usual, which is a shame.
Yeah.
Which
It's
is
the
a shame.
process they know though, right? I mean, when you get stressed, you just follow the things you know. You don't want to necessarily start something new in order, just for the sake of the newness of it, right?
Right. Right. And so, my advice, to defense companies that fit that profile is, allow the space for the global trade team to work the problem, and a good opportunity to work through the AUKUS exemption is not in a high pressure situation where orders need to go out the door within the next 2 days. It's being part of the international business strategy that you've laid out for next year and analyzing which things might be able to fit under the AUKUS framework.
All right. It's interesting because I mean the AUKUS, I've heard so many good, bad parts of it. It's like this is a great unifying thing between the UK and Australia and the US. But then I've heard like there's been back and forth with, the executive branch and the president around, okay, are we doing this? How are we going to do this? And so, anyways, it's interesting to hear the inside of like, hey, it actually exists. It's just not a lot of people are leveraging it because of the other pressures they're around. They're like, let's just do regular licenses. Like we know how to do that. We can do that in our sleep.
Mhm.
It's interesting to have that kind of tension of new and faster potentially, but also slower simply because you don't have enough capacity or bandwidth or trade compliance people to actually go forth and do the work needed to lay the groundwork. So yeah, that's an interesting little tension there.
Yep.
Um,
Yep. And one thing to keep in the front, when it comes to AUKUS, to keep in the front of everyone's mind is that, it's not deregulating exports to the UK and Australia. It's actually increasing the walls around the UK, Australia, and the US to allow freer trade between the three countries. But the complexity comes into play when, you're involving activities that need to cross over that wall again or into that wall, and all you've done is you've extended the bounds of the ITAR. Really, instead of being around the United States, it's now around the UK and Australia in a way. And so that inherently it doesn't increase complexity, it shifts it to different parts of the equation.
Interesting. Well, with that being said, on the AUKUS piece, because I know it sounds like, hey, people should be adding that to their belt. On the closing remarks side, any other words of wisdom, Stephen, as we kind of went through this today and all of your experience and all of the DTS experience that you guys have, anything related to export control that people should be aware of, intersections of CUI, CMMC, landmines. You have thousands of people you are now communicating to. Give them some sage advice on navigating this very complex landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think the best advice I can give is that we are a global economy, and the defense industry is going global, and the world is just going to continue to not, to be a more dangerous place, and that's going to require allies and partners to be buying more U.S. origin technology and engaging more complicated transactions. So having a strong global trade compliance resource is a competitive advantage for your business and is not something to skimp on. I would say a good comparison of that would be having access to solid cybersecurity hygiene, experts like at Summit 7, to be able to make sure that the cybersecurity infrastructure for your business is structured in a way to where you can go and compete and get access to the U.S. government contracts. Because at the end of the day, whether you're talking about global trade or you're talking about cybersecurity and CMMC, it's all designed to protect the U.S. warfighter and protect our technology at the end of the day. And so when you have the resources and the expertise to be able to do that, then you can focus on winning business. Then you can focus on supporting our allies. Then you can focus on executing your contracts. Without that foundation, you're going to be left behind.
There it is. You heard it first, guys. You've probably already heard that before because it's a very common message coming out of this space right now. But at the same time, it doesn't change the truth of it, right? It's either you're going to have a strategic advantage as a business or you're going to lose ground in an area you might not want to lose ground in, right? And that's just the reality of a regulated space that we're entering into even more so, right, than historically. So, Stephen, thank you for joining. We love partnering and working with DTS for any kind of export control, understanding and needs. And to your point, like an outsourced partner that they can actually levy as a small business, which there's not a lot of small business solutions out there or SMB in the trade compliance space. You're actually the only one that I know. So great company, great team. Stephen, we'll have to have you on again. Thanks for joining. And to everyone watching, we hope you enjoyed and we'll see you next time. Have a good one, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks so much, Seven. Appreciate it.
Yeah.